Good morning. My name is Robin Miller. I'm Senior Corporate and Tax Counsel for Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta, and welcome to our monthly edition of our webcast. Today I'm really excited because sitting to my left is Eric Speakman, and he is the founder of Speakman Management Consulting. He has 27 years of experience as a consultant and facilitator in strategic planning, implementation, and change management. He has special expertise in strategic partnerships, including mergers, which is our topic today. And he's a trainer at the Georgia Center for Nonprofits, and he also has a master's in this area from Georgia State University. So I'm very excited today to present a presentation on mergers where you've got some incredible expertise next to me on this subject. As for me, as Senior Corporate and Tax Counsel, I've been advising nonprofit organizations for almost 30 years on corporate and tax issues. But before we jump ahead into the subject, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the mission of Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta for those of you that aren't familiar. We provide free legal assistance to small community-based nonprofits that serve low-income or disadvantaged individuals. We do this by matching them with amazing volunteer attorneys from corporations and law firms throughout the greater metro Atlanta area. And they assist those nonprofits with their business legal needs. To be eligible to be a client of Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta, you need to be an existing 501c3 organization. You need to serve low-income or disadvantaged individuals, and you need to be unable to afford legal services. If you think you might qualify for our services, please go to our website and you can apply to become a client. We also host these free monthly webcasts as well as live workshops once a month. The workshops are conducted throughout the metropolitan area, and we have hundreds of resources on our website on just about every legal issue that a nonprofit might face, including these webcasts. So please visit our website for additional information. I want to point out that today's presentation on considering a merger is focused on nonprofit organizations combining with other nonprofit organizations. So we are not addressing any kind of merger that involves any kind of for-profit entity, only nonprofit 501c3 organizations that are combining. All right, let's turn to what our agenda is going to cover. We're going to talk about the circumstances that raise nonprofit mergers, and that's really Eric's expertise, one of his areas of expertise, because he consults with so many different nonprofit clients that he sees and has seen over the many years those kinds of issues. Then we're also going to talk about the process of a merger, and Eric has boiled it down into 12 steps, which I love. We'll then talk about more of the legal side of things, how a merger actually happens, what are the different types of mergers you can conduct. And then we're going to close with the challenges and lessons learned along the way. But before we get into that, I think I want to level set, and really I think it's important to understand what is the definition of a merger. It's the combination of two things into one. And I think that's important to think about overall as we get into this topic in more detail.
Great. Thank you very much. Before I get started on this process, I want to do a plug for Pro Bono. If you qualify and you're not a client, I strongly recommend right after this webinar that you go on site and sign up to be a client of Pro Bono. They've done great work. Every client I've worked with and been extremely helpful in every merger and partnership I've done many years. You know, it's not easy running a nonprofit. I know it's not easy. And the environment is getting more challenging. I mean, in my experience, this slide that we have right now about a changing nonprofit environment, I created in 2001, and it's the same issues, it's the same challenges that you all are facing from many years back, that you have more demand, more needs, the clients you deal with have more challenges. At the same time, more competition, more nonprofits are being added and that are looking for boards, funders, staff. So it's challenging to keep a good board, retain staff. And while all these demands are increasing, you're not having the same increase in funding. So basically, essentially, what you guys are having to do, my belief is, more with less. And so with having to do more with less, we have to look at things innovatively. We have to look at it new. And so looking at merger as a strategy to being able to do more with less And our experience has been through a merger that gets some great benefits associated with it. Traditionally, a lot of nonprofits, there's a misperception out there right now that nonprofits believe that if you go to and pursue a merger with another organization, that a foundation will view you as weak or less, or have some concern about it. And actually, our experience of doing this all these years is that foundations and funders like to see you looking at things innovatively and exploring this. And if our experience is if you do this right, that you're either one of two great benefits come about that ultimately I think is, I hate to use the word synergy, but synergy where 1 + 1 = 3, and that you're either being able to create a broader, better continuum of care to serve your clients, producing better outcomes for them, and or you're able to produce some economies of scale from working together, so you're reducing costs or more efficient, being able to operate better to produce the same outcomes for better cost. We've also found that being larger with scale, that there are some other great benefits. One is better public awareness, that going through a merger, if it's done well, is a great opportunity for good press and good coverage and good marketing. And also at the same time, it gives you a better opportunity to advocate a better political voice. Your voice is heard and probably has a better impact to help those that you serve. And also we found that it gives opportunities for growth for employees. And a recent study we just saw said that the number one reason why employees are dissatisfied is because there's not room for growth or being able to move up the ladder. And so a merger gives you that opportunity to give people opportunities for growth. So great benefits associated with it. So how do we do it, and how do we do it right? I view this as an architecture for a successful merger. I also sort of view merger as collaboration 3.0, collaboration on steroids. I don't know, whatever you want to call it. That all a collaboration and then a merger has to have some stuff that's in place. And the first thing is what I call a solid foundation. You can't build unless you have a good foundation. And that foundation is that there's shared purpose among the participants and the partners. You're all on the same page of what you're trying to accomplish, the outcomes you want to achieve together, and that everyone around the table is ready. They're not hesitant. They want to do. They're ready to talk. They're ready to have the tough discussions, and that you have agreed upon processes of how you're going to operate, including what happens if we get into conflict management. So you get everything set up in place to begin to be able to do this, go through some challenging merger negotiations and discussions. And I also think it's great to have a champion. You need to have somebody either on the board or in the community that support what you're trying to do. So that's the foundation. I find the biggest area that I look for first to see if I think it's going to be successful is the relationships. If you do not have a solid relationships among the board and key board and staff that will be negotiating and then ultimately in charge of implementing this, the likelihood of it reaching the outcomes you want is low. And that also I found the better the relationship and the better the time you put into relationship building at the beginning of the process means less time that you in the negotiation process, and you're able to do better implementation. So spend time to getting to know each other. Spend time in honest disclosure and transparency of what you want to accomplish, what you do well, and also your dirty laundry. It's going to come up. We're going to get the lawyers involved with due diligence, so we're going to find out something. If you don't share it soon, it's going to derail the process. The next thing is worthwhile results. And the result should be something positive, something inspirational. Instead of trying to save two organizations from failing, that we want to try to produce a better outcome that leads to, for instance, we merged two workforce development organizations that we were able to help somebody from learning about and then all the way through having a job and supporting them and their family to be successful in the job. So better outcomes. And those involved in it ended up getting better jobs, growing in those jobs, and getting better income. So something worthwhile and exciting that everyone wants to be. Constituency for collaboration, which basically means we want to have the right people around the table, and that you're engaging all key stakeholders, staff, board, funders, partners in this process, and that you're open and you have a communication plan to keep them informed in this process so they're not surprised in the process. Because if they're surprised in the process, you bring them in too late, they will slow down the implementation of making it work. So
it could even derail.
Most of the times, that's usually the derail is a key stakeholder. And the last thing is we need to have good leadership around the table. So those are the foundations that of successful architecture of a merger. So as Robin said, that we've broken this down into 12 steps, basically a four process in each of those different steps. And these processes are very similar to the processes that you can get funding from the Community Foundation, the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta, their strategic restructuring fund that they have in place. And that if you feel like it's going to be a good chance for a merger, I strongly recommend you go on their site and do it. And the first phase is feasibility and assessment. Basically, you get a chance to know each other better to determine if it could work. The next one is negotiating a merger, which is being able to negotiate and address key strategic issues and developing a plan that how you're going to move forward. Then we move into how we're going to make this work. So we know what we want to accomplish, breaking that down into the steps and processes that are required for successful restructuring and preparing for integration. And this is when you really got to make sure that Robin and her team are involved in this process, and you're doing it right, and you're doing the right merger, because there's a lot of different variations on this. And then the next is implementation and integration. So the first step in the process, like I mentioned, the more time that you spend at the beginning doing it right, our experience is less time that you are in the negotiation and the planning phase, and then also the more effective you are in integration. So doing these things up front, upright, will save you time, headache, and heartburn down the road in the process. I want to skip the getting started slide and going straight into the feasibility and assessment. And there's 3 steps in this process. One is sort of defining the current situation about yourself and getting to know each other. The second is a little finding out what are the issues, what are the concerns, what are the opportunities to explore that need to be addressed in the negotiation stage. And at that point, getting to know each other a little bit better and doing a little bit due diligence.
I don't know about you, Eric, but I often find that when I hear from clients that are considering a merger or that are in the merger process, the first thing I hear is, well, I called up the executive director of so-and-so and we went and had coffee, right?
Exactly.
And they just started talking. And, so, and they openly started having a discussion. And depending on how that went was if there was another discussion.
Which is a good point, which you have to have a great relationship with the CEOs, the EDs, and the board chair. But before you begin that conversation, what's that, Oracle, the Delphi, know thyself first? And so I want to really touch upon that. And then there is a way of approaching somebody that makes you look a little bit more attractive in it. I sort of view this as in a relationship that you're going from knowing each other to pretty quickly getting married. That if you don't do some of these steps first, it's not going to be a good marriage. It might lead to a divorce. So, do these steps and do them well. And the one thing that everybody always underestimates in this process is challenges associated with culture or perceived differences in culture. So I always recommend in this initial feasibility assessment stage that you do a cultural audit to better understand sort of what are the key values and drivers of how people work together and how they work with consumers and clients and each other. If you don't begin addressing it soon, it will become a major problem in integration. So basically at the end of this is we want to identify the key issues that need to be addressed in the negotiation stage. We want to explore creative out-of-the-box opportunities that we want to consider in this merger. And then we also want to get to know each other's strengths and weaknesses and how best to utilize those in the planning process and in the merger of working better together. So as I mentioned, the first thing we need to do is that internal situation analysis, so that know thyself well. I'm happily married, so I don't do these dating websites, but I understand sort of this eHarmony thing that you have to go through like a big long assessment and a lot of questions to better understand yourself and what you're looking for before you kind of go out and look for somebody. I think it's the same exact thing here with a merger, that you need to know, and and you, as the ED, and the board and staff leadership need to all be on the same page about what you do well, your strengths that you bring to the table, and what you don't do well, and because we need to work on both of those together, and that you need to know what you're trying to accomplish from this merger. What change in the theory of change that you're doing, what outcomes that you're looking for in terms of that you serve, and or what outcomes you're looking to try to accomplish in improve economies of scale, operating more efficiently through scale of putting the merger together.
For example, we've had clients where there were two different clients. They served the same population, but they offered different services. And they felt like if they combined, they could more seamlessly provide all of those services to those same clients, and then perhaps even expand who their client base was, providing all of those services together. Or the reverse is they provide the same services to two different clients or groups of clients, and so by combining, they're getting economies of scale by continuing to provide services to all those clients, but perhaps in a more efficient way.
It's a great thing you point, because when we first started doing this in the early 2000s, foundations were looking for cost savings. They were looking for economies of scale in cost savings. And our experience actually found out that, at least in the first few years, there are additional costs associated with the integration to be able to do it right. And so they've learned from that over the years. And I think right now that they have a higher expectation of, for lack of a better term, 1 + 1 = 3 in terms of outcomes for those that you serve. And being able to show via a logic model how you working together are going to have a better impact for those that you serve. They understand that, once if you're focused on that is what your driver, that by coming together, there are some opportunities for scale and cost savings, and that they anticipate there's going to be some cost savings associated with it. But if you do it right and you plan it right, there are funds out there to help you offset the cost, those initial costs of the integration, to be able to then produce some economies of scale. So in year 2 or 3, you're able to get some cost savings, some efficiency, and you're producing the outcomes that you're expected. So,
and in some ways, some of these same issues are applicable in the for-profit world as well, particularly culture, and then those costs associated with that integration, from computer systems alone to a host of other issues.
I did a merger of 2 child advocacy organizations in Charlotte. On one side was the general counsel for Bank of America, and the other was the general counsel for Wells Fargo. And both of them at that time period, it was going through a lot of mergers in banking, and so they were like, why are we spending time in process and relationships on this, and why are we spending time looking at culture? 3 months later, at the end of the process, they said, I can't mention one of the mergers they had. If we'd actually looked at culture and thought of some of these things before the merger, maybe it would have been a little bit more successful in the merger. So yes, I think both of these things go back and forth. And then one last thing I want to say on this is, I had a good comment with a head of a foundation, which I can't say, I have great respect for it, that said, Eric, don't bring me a merger that brings 2 broken organizations and you're trying to fix it together. So that, don't look at this as a way to fix things that need to be fixed. That before you sit down with somebody else, you need to start thinking about what needs to be fixed in your organization and how and what you can do about it now. Don't go to that saying, this is going to be the panacea, this is going to solve all our problems by merging with somebody else. So, and the other things that we found, another internal success factors to think about that lead to it, is that you have board and staff leadership champion. Somebody that's going to go back to the staff and the board and say, process is not easy, but it's worth it. Let's do it. Let's make this happen. That you have past collaboration experience. If you work with the other organization well, it looks out well. I
will say, let's go back to that staff board member issue, and that is, if you are truly combining in a merger, likely there's only going to be one leader. And so you start out with 2 entities with 2 executives or CEOs. And what I often find where these mergers are actually successful is that one of those CEOs or executive directors is getting ready to retire or to step out. And as a result, that makes it a much more positive opportunity.
It's much easier to go through the process if one executive director is decided that, hey, this is enough, that this gives them an opportunity to step out, step away. And we've generally found, even if it doesn't begin that in the process, going through the process, one of the EDs kind of they come to a conclusion that this is bigger than what.
But if they don't, then oftentimes it doesn't work.
That's correct,
right?
Yes. And
so
having two shared CEOs and EDs, I do not recommend that. We found that does not work well. And the other one that is an organization that wants to grow. If your organization's okay with where you're at, you're not going to get the funding support to make the merger happen. So these are the internal success factors. The partner assessment. This is, again, first know where you are at your current situation. Then clarify what you want from a partner. So instead of going to Robin's, right, we meet for coffee because somebody we know, and we say, hey, let's do a merger. Let's start the process. I think first you need to look at what you need from that partner that can maximize your strengths and possibly offset some of the areas that you need to improve upon the organization. So know that in advance and look for partners that meet that, as opposed to going to somebody you know with a relationship. True, you need to have a good relationship. That's you probably chances are you work with them at some point in time. Right. And then
that mental homework needs to be done ahead of time to see what the benefits are.
And here's kind of going with that dating analogy. See which one you'd want to participate with. You're the ED, you call up this other ED. Yeah, we're in the red right now. We're not doing too great right now. Hey, you guys want to merge? Or you get this other call. Hey, yeah, things are challenging, but we're doing well, and we felt what was best for our consumers was a better continuum of care. And we thought we'd like to have dialogue and conversations to see if there's a potential of us working together to produce that outcome. Which one are you more interested to sit down with? Again, I haven't dated in a while, but I'm thinking the second one is more. I'm going to go have coffee or cocktails with the second one. And at the end of this process is that we want to sort of have a good faith that we're going to agree to move forward. Not a legal document, but something in writing that says, this is what we want to accomplish. Here's the outcome we want to accomplish. Here's the purpose. Here's some key issues that we have to address through the process. Here's the timeline. We're committed to go through this process of working together with a group of equals, staff and board together, to go through a negotiation, do due diligence, and learn from each other. So that's the outcome that you want from the first step in the process. And then part of that is we're going to be sharing information. Yeah. So that brings the lawyers in. This is where we bring them in here.
So one of the things that I want to point out is it's great to have that coffee. It's great to start those discussions. But if you're going to start to share any confidential information, any trade secrets about the organization, that you do need that legal document, that non-disclosure agreement that is signed by both parties that basically says that any confidential information that you're sharing, whether it be donor contacts, financials, business practices, all of that, you should have a non-disclosure agreement signed before any of that is shared. And oftentimes I find that sometimes that stuff is shared because everyone wants to be friendly, everyone wants to date and have a wonderful time, want to put on their best face and want to appear to be cooperative. But it's really important because we have had over 30 merger projects come to Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta in the last 7 to 8 years, and most of them don't go through because it is hard. It's a hard process. That doesn't mean it's not worth it. We've had a number that have been successful, but you really want to make sure that you are, if you're going to share that information, that you are protecting it. So the sooner that's in place, the better. After those few high-level conversations, if you start to turn over anything or start to talk about any specifics, you really need that non-disclosure agreement in place. And to Eric's point earlier, that general document that says, yeah, we're going to try and go forward with this merger. We're going to try and have these discussions, and here's our game plan for doing that. That's your letter of intent. And he's right, it's non-binding. It's not saying that we are absolutely going to do this, but it says we're going to explore this, and here's our process, and here's our timeline for doing that. And it's important to have that timeline because you could be in merger negotiations for years if you don't have a timeline. And it needs to be definitive, because at some point, if it's not going to go forward, it can become a detriment to the organization. Whether it be that you need to want to look for a new potential partner, or it's just time to get back to just focusing on your organization and maybe growing that yourself without a merger or other options. So it's really important to have that non-disclosure agreement in place pretty early on. They're pretty standard, but it is helpful to get that from an attorney.
And we also found that sometimes the boards are a little, oh no, we're signing something legal, so they get a little nervous about it. Oh, there's so many what ifs. That Robin seemed done a great job of crafting in sort of contingencies. You know, that we're going to move forward in this timeline to determine that this is financially doable, and then we're going to go share this with stakeholders. And if stakeholders don't support it, we're not going to move forward. So you can have different levels in where that you kind of go no go decisions that are built into the process to alleviate the concerns and any anxieties that will always come about from the board members. Yeah.
And actually, that's really helpful, because what it does is it gives you milestones in which you decide, okay, have we met this milestone? Great, then we can move to the next phase, as opposed to it being this big amorphic process where you're not really sure when to say, yeah, let's move to this next stage. So having that in your letter of intent is really helpful. Even though it's non-binding, it still gives everyone sort of a roadmap for what the process is going to be at a high level. And once you have that non-disclosure in place, and then you have that letter of intent, then you really have this circle of privacy and agreement that you're going to try this and work at it in a positive way.
Yep, great. And then we've decided that we're moving forward, that we maybe want to move in together. So we got to sit down and negotiate.
Furniture.
Exactly. and I recommend here, you know, just like, you know, before you get married, they're required to go see a counselor kind of stuff, or, you know, or something along those lines. That this is a stage in the process. If you don't have anybody that's helping you to kind of through this process, and or a third party neutral to facilitate this, especially if it's a merger of organizations of different sizes.
This is where you need an Eric. You need a consultant that's really going to guide you through, that has the expertise, that knows the different pitfalls, and both the pros and the cons, to help you sort through all these cultural issues. He's got those
tricks.
Well, not tricks, but like your eHarmony example.
Uh-huh.
He's got those forms and those questionnaires that'll help you think through, will this fit? And I will say that I think culture is probably one of the biggest issues where things can fall apart. Because culture has so many different aspects to it.
And it all comes about with if you have a larger and a smaller organization, because it always happens all the time. Even when you set rules that you can only have an equal amount of board and staff members, usually 5 to 8 from each organization, to go through this negotiation process. It's not intentional, but the larger organization that usually financially has more assets has a tendency to, I'm better. You know, just the way their body language is, and the way they ask questions, and the way that they sort of assume that we're doing you a benefit, the smaller organization, and then the smaller organization becomes very defensive. Again, they may not, I don't need that subconscious.
And they may actually be in better financial state. They may be rocking and rolling as their small organization, doing really, really well.
And so they get defensive, and then they have a tendency to then want to really go into immense detail in trying to negotiate the key issues, and are not as receptive to exploring opportunities and looking at creative ways of addressing the issues. So, you know, like I said, they don't mean to do it, but it happens, and it happens every single time that I see them make that happen. So we set the stage for a successful negotiation by having, you know, equal group, and that you agreed upon the process, when you're going to meet, the timeline, how you're going to discuss, ground rules of how we're going to work together, conflict management, et cetera, et cetera.
And I assume different topics. So
That's
each
correct.
meeting, as a consultant, you're facilitating, okay, we've got to talk about this issue. We've got to talk about this issue. We've got to talk about employee benefits. We got to talk about salaries. We got to talk about, you know, all the HR related, maybe IT, I presume?
Yeah, there's all these, you always fall under the categories of a nonprofit. You know, that you've got program, that you have HR, staff, board, governance, you have operations, you have marketing, communications, and then it's always fundraising associated with it. So, and also my experience in doing this is that before you get into negotiating these nitty-gritty, could be challenging issues, that you look to find some commonality, something that you're, instead of going straight into adversarial negotiations, discussions, that I like to try to find, work with them to create a shared vision of what they want to be 3 or 5 years down the road that is truly inspirational. So I try to get them two things. One, to get them excited about and seeing that they're all on the same page for the bigger picture. And that every time that we get into some challenges in negotiating the issues, I always bring them back to the big picture. Are we still committed to this? Is this still something important to you all, to the community? Most of the time. It helps them to negotiate a little bit better. And then I look for some small hanging fruit, something that they can do together, a joint event, joint something that they can do together, that reinforces what we're trying to accomplish long term. They get to see each other in a non-adversarial, they're working together, getting the staff to work together and all that. And it sort of builds excitement for, oh, wow, this is great things to accomplish. And part of that small victories, I highly recommend that the executive director from each organization go and meet with the staff of the other organization, and that they do a presentation to inform that, because chances are that staff does not know all the things the other do. Every time I've done it, they don't know, even though they may work together for years, and answer questions. And to be able to show that this person is sincere about wanting to produce good outcomes for the staff. And one thing I forgot to mention before this is, you've got to keep them well informed. So as soon as you decide that we're gonna look at this, create a communications plan. I always create talking points for staff, and that the executive director goes at the next staff meeting after that we decided we're going to look at this, that does these talking points, and that you communicate these talking points to staff, all board, and to key funders and supporters of the organization, so that they aren't, and volunteers and others, so they're not surprised by it, kind of stuff. And that you have at each one of these steps, you're going to communicate different talking points to keep them informed so they're not surprised in the process.
And of course, making sure they know it's confidential and shouldn't be.
That's correct, yes.
Presented to the public in any way.
Yes.
So, yes.
So we go through, we look at the vision to get them excited, and then we negotiate these issues. And then addressing these issues, we try to look at what's got to be different. What's going to be different in the organization in response to how do we create this new continuum of care that better serves. So we'll look at what we want to accomplish long term, and then we have to look at what needs to happen in the first year, so that we're excited about the long term, but we also have something that we know that we can be doing right away to drive that and make the change happen. So throughout this whole process, I want Robin's team. She'll get a lawyer for both of your sides to go and do some serious due diligence. And man, they go through. If you think you're going to hide something, it ain't going to happen, man. It's going to be, everything is going to come out through this due diligence process.
And I want to point out that it is important that each side has their own lawyer. A lot of times I'll have a client that'll be like, well, why can't we just have one? But you can't, because a lawyer can only represent one client. Technically, these clients are opposing, even though they're trying to come together, but they each have their own interests. And so a lawyer can only represent one client's interests. So it is important to have both. And particularly in a merger, it's really important to have that counsel who's going to help you to think through these issues and to understand the results of the due diligence. When you find a liability, what does that mean? And what is that risk? And those are different liabilities than the liabilities Eric's talking about with culture and things like that. But this is a liability of maybe your employee benefit structure, or maybe there's a lawsuit that's been filed against one of these clients, or a threatened lawsuit, or some other things that are going on that have legal implications that would still exist once that merger is completed.
Yep.
or could still exist.
They do great work. And by working together, that we craft a plan of how we're going to make this merger work. High level plan, not detailed plan, where we're looking at what is the consolidated mission, driven from what are the outcomes and purposes that you want to accomplish by coming together, a shared vision for the future, and then to be able to drive that, what are 3-year objectives in each major area of this consolidated organization? Programs, ops, HR, communications, marketing, fundraising. And then under each one of those, what do we need to do right away? Again, but still very high level, not great details, and clarity on the outcomes. And then take that back. Remember the first stage of the process, we sought and we got feedback from all the key stakeholders who are going to make this happen. Send a summary of this plan to them. Ask their feedback, especially staff and especially funders, because they're going to be the two that are going to drive it. The staff to implement it and the funders to get the funding to be able to implement, make it happen. So we want to make sure those two are really happy about the process. And if this looks really good at the time, we have a great relationship with Cox Curry. So we'll begin looking and exploring with Cox Curry the opportunities of we don't call it capital campaigns because we may not be building bricks and mortar, but we're building capacity to serve better outcomes. So looking at and then possibly sharing with other foundations that you may not be working with to see if there's some interest in supporting this for the future. So we won't. What we're doing.
It's also to cover the cost of the merger.
That's correct. Yes, both.
So because like you said, it does take 2 or 3 years. Mergers are expensive in a certain way. So if you can get that additional funding to cover some of that merger through community foundation or through other funding.
And luckily they know that. They've learned and they understand. And if that they're willing to put in a 3-year investment to make things happen. And so and the result of this reviewing and socializing doesn't usually change the plan a lot, but it just builds support for implementation and integration, which is always an underlooked and underestimated process. So it helps for that. And then the last one is that that the boards actually vote, that we are going to move forward. In that legal agreement, we can still have a little milestones and constituencies. We've got room for flexibility, but you're basically saying, we're moving forward. We still have work to do, but we are going to do this. We're going to move forward and make that happen.
That's the merger plan
Yes.
that the lawyers will draft up that will ultimately be filed and actually also has to be sent to the Attorney General. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that now. So just to kind of give you now that big picture just from a legal counsel perspective, we've already talked about, once you've done that initial high-level due diligence, you're going to talk about, you're going to discuss the different merger options. So you've got that high-level due diligence, you're going to get your non-disclosure agreement right in place, then you're going to do your letter of intent, which we've also talked about, that says, hey, we're going to talk through this, we're going to start dating, we're going to start sharing information, getting to know each other, and see whether this makes sense. As we've said, it's non-binding, limited, and it does talk about the ultimate goals and what are trying to accomplish, and the milestones along the way. Then we're going to do all that legal due diligence. Now we're going to get in and really look under all the leaves. We're going to try and see what's going on with each organization and really get to know each other in detail. And once all of that is done, then we're going to say, okay, well, what kind of merger would make sense? Because nonprofits actually have more merger options than for-profits do. So I'm going to talk about those different merger options in a few minutes. But so then you discuss, okay, how are we going to come together as one? And what's that legal structure going to look like? And then once you get to that, then you start doing all the legal documents. You rely on the lawyers to help pull that all together and to get so that the boards can approve the different documents and get everything set up so that you can become one entity.
My experience in working with all the pro bono lawyers is that they do this, but they don't do it to where it's interfering with the ED doing their job of keeping the organization running, right? And looking at a merger. So it can be a challenging time that they do a great job of taking care of all these things that have to be done without it being a hindrance to the executive director. I don't know how they do it, but I don't hear any complaints. So
I think the hardest part is the due diligence, where you have to really go in, gather the information. You have to have a point person from each organization that it's their job to make sure that they're getting all the information that's needed in that due diligence and sharing it with the other party. And I think that's probably the biggest hurdle is really going in and getting all the information that's needed to be analyzed.
And we've done so many of these. They're always the same common issues that always come up, challenges and issues, and usually that need to be negotiated with. One is governance. Who's going to be in control? Which board's going to have more board members associated with it? And if we're going to get all these boards together, how we're going to merge? Our experience has been that the opportunity of merging together, that several board members will self-select to not continue on. Hey, we've done this a while. We're happy to step in.
But combining and having double the board members where you've got both together does not work. And that's important. The other factor that you actually have to think about is members. So nonprofit organizations can legally have members. And I'm not talking about, oh yes, I'm a member. I get the newsletter once a month. But actual legal membership, where you vote. You have an annual meeting and you vote and to choose the directors of each organization. If one entity has members and the other doesn't, you're going to have to decide what that future structure is, and will there be members or will there not? And there's a whole process for eliminating members if you're not going to have members. But yeah, and then to your point though, you're not going to have this huge board.
And then we usually play little tricks here and there to be able to try to get the ultimate situation is you have the equal amount of board members from each organization. And if one's larger, or that you have, has more board members, we'll say, each has at least the opportunity to have 7 or 8 or something along those lines, that it feels like it's not one side trying to gain control. And then if they have more board members that after the merger, then they're going to come and shut down our program kind of stuff. Trust me, these concerns have come up many times. Well, I'm going to skip to the next one, which is program issues. Every time I do a staff focus group, every staff says, well, we do things different and better than the partner does. And wait a minute, if we do this merger, how can we guarantee that our program is going to be continued into perpetuity? Well, how are you guaranteeing it now? Kind of stuff. Yeah, the chances are that the merger itself will provide you more financial sustainability for continuing your program. But trust me, it will come up working with your staff. Financial issues. Nobody wants to get married to somebody who's got a big college debt or other debt associated with it. So debt is always a big issue. There are creative ways of dealing with debt that Robin and her team have done. If we haven't been able to find a funder that would help support and offset that debt by just creating something new. But if there is a debt, I can tell you the other organization is going to be very risk adverse and going to be very concerned and want a whole lot of stipulations associated with moving this forward and being able to address this and take on this debt. One of the other key big ones is, well, who's in charge? Who's the ED? And me and Robin have already talked about it. And the other big one is...
let's stick with human resources for just a minute. Perfect. Because each organization has its own structure. They have their salary structure. They have their employee benefits. And those may vary from one organization to another, particularly if you have a smaller organization or larger organization. And so depending on which entity survives, how you're going to mesh those two structures together gets really complicated.
I want to keep my benefits. I don't want my benefits in this merger to get worse. It's going to be I don't want my pay. I don't want to lose my job because they're afraid. Staff is afraid if you're going to bring two together, you're going to lose jobs because that's what happens in the corporate world. 90% of the time we find you're actually adding staff because you are creating a bigger continuum of care. But staff will be concerned about that. And then one big one that's always is, what about our brand? We've built this great brand in the community. Our experience has been that one of the greatest issues of most nonprofits is they're not well known. And even though that you are well known within your circle, you're probably not as well known in the general community as you desire and you want. So we actually find that this is a great opportunity to looking at a new brand, but then going through a transition to where you're leveraging and you're continuing through a period of 12, 24 months of you're continuing to use your brand, your name, as you move into something newer. We put two organizations that serve refugee-serving organizations, and they actually came up with a new name that now is well-branded. I don't want to say who it is, but individually the two together had names that only a few people knew. and now together, 4 years later, are well known throughout the community, and more importantly, well known within the funding community. So these are the issues that always happen. Then we agreed that we're moving forward in the next stage. In these next 2 stages, I'm not going to go into great detail on this. If you want more, we've got tons of worksheets and a lot more detail on how to make these happen. I generally find that we need to give you the information to make those first 2 steps work. And if they do work, feel free to give me a call. Please not at 4 o'clock in the morning, but that we will be happy to give you tools and give you some advice on how to make these work. So I'm just going to highlight a few key things associated with this. We've set the high level plan. Now we got to get more details. We got to flush out how we're going to make that happen. So basically, for lack of a better term, you're creating a detailed strategic plan on how the merger is going to come about, and beginning to think about the implications of integrating 2 organizations in all aspects. So we're not only creating detail to this and creating a strategic plan, we're also looking at, for lack of a better term, sort of creating a Gantt chart of really detailed things we're going to do in the first year of being able to integrate all the different aspects of the organization. So we're getting into detail. And then we need to create sort of structures and processes, creating task forces of both organizations to manage the key parts of the integration, so that not only does that help do the integration, but it also helps to get to know each other better, because you're working together to be able to prepare and do the integration. And then we move into, I'm going to skip the next slide to move into implementation, what we want to, and here again, you're always going to underestimate how challenging it is to do the implementation and integration, and especially the culture. So I like to do, while we're going through this planning process, looking for opportunities for the staffs to get together. And that at the end of we've decided that we're going to merge, it's a time to celebrate, and also a time to get some press, time to get your name out there. And this is something that press, we find, are interested in. And it's easy to get coverage on these mergers. So at the end of it, we want to create talking points and a communications plan to educate the greater community about that. And that hold a event together, some sort of event that is a combination social and revealing what we plan on doing. If you want to pass the plate, feel free to ask for contributions to be able to make it happen. But to show that, that we're all on the same page trying to accomplish something. And then, so it helps with that cultural integration. We've learned from the past, the new CEO, trying to be the new CEO for this organization and manage everything associated with the integration and go out and try to raise more funds for this doesn't work. It's tough. So we always recommend that you have somebody on your staff of this consultant, that's sort of the integration manager, that they would be the person that through the Gantt work chart and through implementation timeline with action steps associated, that would be the person that's managing and tracking that. And that we want to begin using these task forces to implement and integrate the things to make things happen. That's actually
true all the way through, from the beginning phase through the end. You've got to have that person on each side that's really designated to have that role. And even remove some of what they do already, because everybody's already busy, right. More than busy in their jobs and at nonprofits. And so you have to really think that through if you're really going to go down the path from the beginning. Who is that person that's going to lead this effort for your organization? And it usually is not going to be the executive director or CEO, because their plate's already way too full.
True, very true. And then culture. Again, everybody always underestimates culture. And so what I found, even though both organizations are usually very proud of the way that their culture is and the way that they work with clients, that they are willing to recognize it's not perfect. And so instead of viewing this as we're going to take what's best from you and what's best from you and we're going to try to put it together, I actually like to look at creating new, better shared norms and values and culture. So you're creating a new culture that's shared together, that you put it together, and that it's something that's better on how you work with your consumers, the clients, those that you serve, as opposed to trying to pick and choose and put stuff from one to the other. Usually the end product is you're taking a little bits from each one, but the fact that staff working together to create something better helps them to not be less defensive about, and we don't hear at meetings, well, that's not the way that we used to do it, kind of stuff, because that's what you want to get away from. You want to get less of, that's not what we did, to we're excited about what we want to do, kind of stuff. And if your merger isn't something that creates some inspiration and excitement, I'm telling you, it's going to be tough for successful and to maintain it and seek funding for you to be able to do a greater impact. So, and the last step, step 12, is monitor and evaluate. So I recommend 90 days into the process that the consolidated board kind of look at progress on this Gantt chart, on this implementation plan of action timeline. Make it simple for them. Green, we're on task. Yellow, we're behind. Red, whoa, we need some help. To be able to look at what do we need to adjust, change, or if the board needs to help in some of these aspects and moving things forward. And I find that if they're excited about it, that they can be really involved in integrated fundraising, integrated community awareness kind of stuff, to leverage that excitement that we've created from the plan to be able to move these things forward that you weren't able to do with your board by yourself as a single organization. And then 1 year down the road, same thing. Bring the consolidated board together, review progress, and then set the goals for the next year. What do we need to do to continue successful integration to accomplish the outcomes that we want to do, and how, as we as a board, can be engaged and be able to make that happen. So that's the steps in the process. Again, if you want more details, we got them. We're happy to send them to you.
All right, so now let's turn to the 4 different merger structure options that exist from a legal perspective in the nonprofit arena. So first is asset transfer and dissolution, which is not a true merger, and I'll talk about that. Consolidation, parent-subsidiary relation, which is also not a true merger, and then merger of entities. When I say not a true merger, what it does is it accomplishes the same goals. Depending on what your goals are, it can accomplish them, but it's not actually a combining of two things into one. So let's start with asset transfer and dissolution, which I think happens more often than any other of the 4 when it comes to nonprofits. And it's particularly useful when one of the organizations has a lot of liabilities. So,
debt.
Yeah, well, or just potential liabilities associated with potential lawsuits, with a history of some issues that may have been there that are still sort of lurking in the background. So what happens in an asset transfer is entity A transfers its assets to entity B, and then entity A dissolves. So, so all of the physical assets, all of the programming, all of that gets transferred over to entity A through an agreement, from entity A to entity B through a written agreement. And they can do that without payment because they're both 501c3 public charities, and that's allowed. So there doesn't have to be a payment back to entity A for those assets. Through the process, of course, you're going to talk about maybe hiring on the people that were in entity A to be employees in entity B. And so you're going to have discussions around also revenue contracts. So if entity A has 4 different grants, are those grants transferable to entity B? And you would look at that in a due diligence process, of course, and then making sure that that is then transferred over or assigned to entity B. And of course, I mentioned the employment issues. So if that all works, then in the process, you always have to go to the Attorney General of the state of Georgia to get the approval. The Attorney General oversees all 501c3 Georgia nonprofit corporations. And so when you're talking about dissolving one, when you're talking about transferring substantially all your assets or all your assets or doing a merger, you must go to the Attorney General and get approval first, because nonprofit corporations in Georgia exist for the benefit of the public. And so they're entrusted with public funds, donations, any assets, it's all through public funds. And they're entrusted with those to protect those. And so before you were to do something significant with those, you'd need to get approval from the government. So that's probably the most common one that we see. The second one, which we don't see very often, but I do want to mention it, and it kind of goes to Eric's point of starting fresh, is you've got entity A and entity B, and they merge into a completely new entity C. This is a long-term process because entity C has to obtain 501c3 status prior to the merger. So this, and right now it's taking 6-9 months easily to get approval for 501c3 status. So as a result, it's a longer process. It has some great benefits because you're basically this new fresh entity. You've got new branding, you've got new approach, and it removes some of this, well, we used to do it this way issues. So all the assets and liabilities, though, both, not just the assets, but the liabilities as well, from entity A and entity B go into entity C. The benefits also, though, any gifts, any donations, any grants, any promises will also go into entity C unless there's a very specific provision that says that should there be a merger, this money will not transfer and it will revert back. That's one of those things you go through in due diligence. The lawyers will ask all those questions. We'll look at all that to determine that. But usually everything will transfer in. And then entities A and B just disappear through the consolidation process. If you have really different employment structures, that's really helpful to have that. So that you in some of these other inconsistencies between the two to help bring that synergy together. The third one is parent subsidy, and this is really interesting. So maybe you've got entity B that wants to really take over entity A, but you don't want to merge together. So instead what happens is entity A's articles of incorporation is changed, and it creates a membership structure, and the sole member of entity A is entity B. What that allows for is for entity B to elect the directors and officers of entity A, and so it's a control change. So there's no actual merger. It's just and the two entities stay together, but it's sort of this parent and subsidiary. And so now entity B controls entity A and chooses who the officers are, who the directors are, and then can run it. It's if you're not sure you want to combine, this is a great way to do it initially.
Living together,
yeah,
but not married
not
yet.
married, exactly. Where you see if it works. All the assets and liabilities stay in each entity, but there's this element of control, and each of the employee structures remain. It doesn't give you quite the synergies that a merger will give you, but it gives you a chance to see whether you can work together or whether it works. And sometimes it's more beneficial than an actual merger, depending on the circumstances of the nonprofits. The last one is the true legal merger, and that's where entity A merges into entity B. And in the process, all of the assets and liabilities of entity A are transferred or assumed by entity B. You don't have to dissolve entity A because it happens through the merger process. In each of these, you would, with the exception of the parent subsidiary example, you would need to go to the Attorney General. But entity A dissolves, you have the complete merger situation. This is, of course, more difficult to unwind than the parent subsidiary situation. The benefit there's more risk because you're taking on the liabilities of entity A, so the asset transfer gives you less risk. But it's that complete merger. You can change the name of entity B in the process. You can change the articles and bylaws to match in some of the processes that you go through to determine how the structure is gonna end up. So it's not that you have to stay with what entity B currently is in that merger process, and all that can be negotiated. But one entity goes out of existence through that merger process. So merger legal issues, and we've talked about a lot of this already, so I'm going to run through this very quickly. But it's that full combination. You've got to make sure you're doing all that good due diligence and doing the hard work. The due diligence and the discussions and the negotiations is all the really important hard work that you need to do before you get married. Understanding what all those liabilities are and how to address them, and coming up with creative ways to address them. Corporate structure, I've already mentioned this. You've got to deal with any differences in the corporate structure and merge that together. The tax status of the remaining entity is really important. We had two clients, or a situation where there were two nonprofits that were merging. One turned out was a private foundation and one was a public charity. So what was the remaining entity? Well, we wanted it to be the public charity. And so we had to address that differential and those issues. You also want to make sure that the entity that survives has its exempt status, that it hasn't been revoked. So it's really important to look at the tax status. Employment alignment, we've talked about this a few times. Want to make sure that that will all work. Restricted funds, this is really important. This is huge. Oftentimes a nonprofit will have restricted funds. These funds can only be used for purpose X. Well, you might have to get approval from the donor to use it in this merged entity. Or that when you merge it together, that it's really clear that these funds can still only be used for purpose X.
You better be involving this funder at the beginning of this process.
Yes, because it's really important, or they'll take the money away, or they'll sue you. And so it's really important to make sure you understand in that due diligence process where those restricted funds are and what they are and what the restrictions are on those. There can also be contract restrictions. You may have a contract with for programming, and there may be restrictions in that contract. And so you've got to work through all those details in that due diligence to understand how you're going to make that contract work in the new entity. Regulatory approvals can be needed, depending on what you're doing and how you're operating. If you've got approval from the Department of Health and Human Services for certain projects, you may need to go to the Department of Health and Human Services and get further approval. You may need to go to other government entities and get approval for the work that you're doing, depending on what that work is. So we've pretty much already covered this next one. I'm just going to point out that you've got that plan of merger. You've got to go to the Attorney General for approval of that plan of merger. And then the last thing, which we hadn't talked about yet, is that there's actually articles or a certificate of merger that have to be prepared and submitted. And that's sort of that final step to implement from a legal perspective, the merger. Then the hard work of the real implementation begins. And that's where the changes happen, the name change happens, the articles, bylaws get changed, and the other entity goes out of business.
Summing up, you better have lawyers involved in this process. That's all I got to say. That's advice. I want to speed up on these last two so that we can have some time for questions. From a funder's perspective, I talked about sort of the misperception of what most nonprofits think about funders. Funders also are telling us that they're not, nonprofits aren't coming to them and asking them. They're basically saying, come talk to us about it. If you're considering it and we're funding you, come talk to us. That they look at this as a strength. So the funders are supportive of this, and actually the various different aspects, the different versions of collaboration, that their preference is funding a merger as opposed to some of these other joint venture, management service organizations, these other options. So they are open to mergers. They want to talk to you. So don't be afraid. Reach out to them. That's the best thing I can recommend. And the common merger mistakes, I'm just going to summarize it with, don't do the things. You better do the things we talked about doing.
Right.
You don't do them. You don't do them. You don't do them. Yeah. You're going to have a lot of. This is going to drag out too long. I found that if it drags out too long, people don't feel inspired about it. Then our experience is that people aren't as engaged. Board members don't show up to these meetings, and then it sort of just slowly dies.
That's why I think it's important also to have that time frames, those specific time frames, because you have to have those go, no-go decisions. And I think those are really important because you don't want it just sitting there hanging over your heads for 2 years and nothing's getting done. And then finally someone just it just falls apart. I think you need really clear definition as to, yes, we're moving forward, no, we're not. And these other two slides, I think, are information that we've really pretty much already covered.
Just one other quick thing that it's, that especially if you have corporate people that have been through mergers, they're really interested in process and task. My experience has been that people that are involved in a nonprofit, even if they're paid, are somewhat a volunteer. So there's a lot of emotions associated with it. So you really need to really not just culture throughout this process, but people concerns and issues. If you don't address them, it won't work well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any questions?
Any questions?
We open up to questions.
One question. I don't know if it's quick. You talk a lot about culture. If during phase one you identify that the cultures are quite different, do you have any suggestions on what to do, whether or not to proceed to a phase two, or at that point?
I think that you have to recognize that there's going to be differences in cultures. And I've also generally found that what people say are big differences in culture are really not that big. And that, being cognitive of it, acknowledging it with the staff up front, because there's where it's going to happen, in most cases, and continuing to address it and continuing to look for opportunities during the negotiation stage and others of staff getting to know each other. That first stage, have the ED go and visit with that staff, to highlight what they do, answer questions. Again, look for other opportunities for staff to get together. And then as you decide to integrate, again, go from a situation of trying to pick and choose, of having the staff work together to come up with a shared, something more that they recognize they couldn't do in terms of culture and being able to work with clients the way they want to by themselves. So looking at a new way of looking at it.
That said, I will say that there are times where it isn't going to work. I've seen where cultures are just so different and it's integrated into processes. It's one thing to have a cultural, an environment that you work in. One might be more serious, one might be more relaxed and easygoing. But if that goes down to the processes, that could ultimately not work. Where if the processes and the way in which they accomplish their work is so entirely different that it may not work. And I really do think you have to investigate that further and really dig into what are those cultural differences and what types of cultural differences are they to make that decision. And I think there's some great consultants that can help with analyzing that and helping people to understand whether those are differences that you can overcome or not.
And also, as the leader, your responsibility to be able to address these, but always stay high ground, always communicating the grander vision and mission, so that you give people, you get them focused more on these greater outcomes, to be able to help better address the road bumps that you and challenges that you go through that will always occur in integration. And the other lesson learned is, you think that you said it enough? No. If you think you've said what we're trying to accomplish enough, you need to repeat it 5, 6 more times, 7 more times to the board. So people always underestimate communication. Keep repeating the big picture. Keep repeating the vision over and over. So you're so sick of hearing it yourselves, then maybe the others are going to start to hear it. So.
But on the culture side, what will happen is if you do merge, you end up seeing most of the employees from the one that the culture didn't survive, or the culture really didn't integrate into something new, didn't morph into something different, those people will depart. And then you lose all that human capital.
Okay. Well, thank you. That's all the questions we have.
Wonderful.
Thank you.